Welcome back to the study in the Gospel of Matthew. Last study, we went through the genealogy of Jesus Christ, and we just focused on David and Abraham, understanding how important genealogies are and the promises that started in the Garden of Eden. We'll get into the spiritual and the theological importance of the Gospels very shortly, but I wanted to set the stage. If we were in Israel at the time of Jesus, like what would it be like? What is the expectation? What is the vibe, if you will? What's happening? What is the history behind us and our people? So let's look into the history, and we'll start at Solomon's death, and we'll come up into the first century when Jesus was born and into the early church, what was happening. So after some time, the Israelites rejected having a prophet, and they decided they wanted a king. So they told Samuel to get lost. And but God said, "Hey, Samuel, they don't hate you; they hate me. So let's give them a king." So they chose Saul, big, tall guy, probably real handsome. We'll take this guy to be our king. So they allowed that. God allowed that. But really, God wanted to show them the type of person that he would want leading his people. So he had Samuel go anoint King David, the son of Jesse, even while Saul was in charge. We went over that a little bit in my last study, so I won't dwell on that. But after David became, the kingdom went to Solomon. There was some family drama. David almost lost his power in his life from one of his sons, but Solomon got that ability, and he also was able to build the first temple. But after Solomon died, the kingdom was divided. There was widespread idolatry and just general instability. The northern tribes were called Israel. The capital was Samaria. The southern kingdom, Judah, and that capital was Jerusalem. So Judah did experience some reforms, especially under Asa, Jehoshaphat, and Hezekiah. So you can read a little bit about these times. This would be between 931 BC and 722 BC. So the kingdom is divided. So that's a pretty quick fall, and that's a lesson to us. So with the divided kingdom, as they struggle amongst themselves, between tribes, the north and south, and between themselves and the people around them, in 722, the Assyrians conquer the north and basically deport them. This is the first diaspora, basically, of the 10 tribes of the north. That was led by Shalmaneser V and Sargon II. So in 2 Chronicles 11:16, the northern tribes moved to Judah during Rehoboam's reign. In 2 Chronicles 15, Asa gathered the people from Ephraim, Manasseh, and Simeon. 2 Chronicles 30 and verses 1, 10 through 11, and 18, Hezekiah invited all of Israel to the Passover. In the New Testament, in Luke 2:36, Anna the prophetess is of the tribe of Asher, and that shows that her tribal lineage lives on even in New Testament era, which is just before the times of that destruction and before the Talmud. I'll let Jesus comment on the situation with the Jewish leaders, but he did say they were the blind leading the blind. They didn't fully understand what was happening. So prophetically, Ezekiel 37 is a great example. God gives Ezekiel a vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, and that is basically Israel wandering through the world. He says, prophesy to bring breath into those bones and bring them to life, basically save them as a remnant. The next vision in that chapter is of a stick. Take two sticks. It's an example, not a vision. Taking one stick, call it Judah, the other hand Ephraim, and all the house of Israel, and bind them together, and tell the people that I will bind them together in my hand together and put them in their land. So this is a prophecy about saving the remnant. They're alive. And then in the end times, at some point, he's going to bring them together, bring life into them. He's going to save them. And in Revelation, it's very specific. It names the tribes, says that he's going to gather them from the four winds again, and explains how they're going to be protected through those end times. So the tribes aren't lost. So along with the dispersion of the Israelites out of their land in the north, the Assyrians and people from other areas come in and fill the north. And now they're populated with foreign people. They're not Israelites anymore. But when the Israelites return, they commingle, they intermarry, and these people become known as the Samaritans, the people of Samaria. I'll explain a little more about the Samaritans when we get to an incident between a Samaritan woman and Jesus in the Gospels, but just understand that they have kind of similar origins because they did intermingle, but they have theological differences. And then in the times of Jesus, basically, they just did not get along. They didn't even talk to each other. So that was an issue as well. And the Assyrians were good at just trying to wipe out and kind of dilute nations and just to keep them, not as strong as if they were united. Well, the north has been dispersed, and now Judah is kind of left alone. So that between 722 and 586, Judah is still existing, but they are really troubled by Assyria from Egypt and Babylon. They had a couple of good revivals. The Book of the Law was found under kings Hezekiah and Josiah. They reformed, they repented, and they followed the law, and there were some good times. But we'll see what happens next. You can read these accounts in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zephaniah, and Habakkuk. So unfortunately, we come to 586, where Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II comes and destroys Jerusalem. Their armies just overtook Judah, taken hostage. God told them to not resist or they would die. If they go with the Babylonians, go with the king, they will survive. And that's how these remnants are protected. God is using this for a purpose. If you read the book of Daniel, it's an amazing account of these times. It's also very prophetic. It even explains the history of those silent years between Micah and the Gospels. They weren't so silent. A lot of history was happening, and the Jews exist, so it was happening to them as well. So we'll get more into that too as we get closer to the times of Christ. Just as an aside, the book of Daniel will also kind of give us insight into these kings from the east that come to see where the king of the Jews was to be born. So when we get there, we'll talk more about Daniel. So we come to 539 to 331 BC. That period is the Persian Empire. Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon. So it appears Babylon was not the strongest at the time. Along comes Persia. So an interesting thing here is that a portion of the Bible is written by Cyrus. He decrees that he will allow the people of the true and living God to return and rebuild, because God had Ezra show King Cyrus, him being called by name and being called his anointed in the scriptures before this issue. And so that made him an instant believer and allowed them to come back, and he protected them. And he helped put guards along the wall, and they were able to rebuild. So Zerubbabel leads from around 536 to about 516 BC when the Second Temple was rebuilt. In 458 and 445 BC, Ezra and Nehemiah lead those who returned later, and those kind of revivals. During this time, Judah was called Yehud, and it was just basically a province under Persian rule. So they were protected, but they didn't have complete anonymity, autonomy. All right, we're getting into the 3rd century BC. Between 331 and 323 is the Hellenistic period, and Alexander the Great enters the scene. He defeats Persia, and Judea is absorbed into Hellenistic world, just like all of his other conquered lands. The Jews are granted religious freedom by Alexander. He's not threatened by that. The culture and influence of the Hellenists is spreading, especially in the urban areas. And Koine Greek, Koine meaning common, is the common language throughout the lands that Alexander conquers. And since Israel was a province of Persia, they too have to speak Greek for official purposes. The amazing thing about the Koine Greek is it's very specific. It has very specific rules. It describes many aspects of a situation. It's very purposeful. I think it's a divine language specific for a very specific time. I get into that a little bit on my Origins of the Bible study. And then there's a ton of resources out there. So if you want to look into that, I highly recommend that. Koine Greek is amazing. After the Hellenistic period, the Ptolemaic rule starts in 323, where the Hellenists ended, and through 198 BC. Ptolemy being a successor of Alexander after his death. It's basically a dynasty of Egypt. The Jews did very well in the Alexandria, forming a significant diaspora. In other words, there's a large gathering of Jews in Alexandria, Egypt, under this dynasty. The 3rd and 2nd century BC is also when the scriptures in Hebrew, collected by Ezra and Nehemiah, were translated into this Koine Greek. That's why I think it's a very divine language at a very divine time. Very specific things told in very specific manners. And because they were done at this period of time, nobody can say with a right mind that it was written after this moment in time, 3rd and 2nd century before Christ. So the Hellenistic culture is basically challenging the Jewish tradition. So there's this clash begins, and it's no longer just the Jews kind of being allowed to be themselves. We're seeing some friction here begin. So we get to 198 BC, and the Seleucid rule begins. Antiochus III, or the Great, defeats the Ptolemies at the Battle of Panium. So the Seleucid Empire gains control of Judea. These whoever was in charge of these areas, and as they were conquered, they were absorbed by that next kingdom. So initially, Antiochus III tolerated the Jewish practices and the culture, but then something happened under Antiochus IV, who called himself Epiphanes, in other words, the manifest God, became ruler, and then he started forcing Hellenization on even the Jews. So he outlawed the Jewish practices, such as circumcision, observing the Sabbath, and studying the Torah, studying the law. He ended up desecrating the temple in 167 BC by sacrificing a pig on the altar at the temple, and then erected an altar to Zeus. So this is beyond atrocious. It was kind of there's an interesting principle that happens where there's a near and a far fulfillment of some prophecies, and they're just kind of a foreshadow. It's kind of a preview of something that's going to happen, and the desecration of desolation that causes desolation is one of them. And this was kind of a micro vision of what is going to happen in the end times in the third temple. Something like this is going to happen again. So the Maccabees under Mattathias of the Hasmonean family wanted their worship back. They fought and wanted their worship back. So they cleansed the temple in 164 BC, rededicated it and purified it. And now that's observed as the festival of Hanukkah. You can look into that and see why the candles are used and why that light is very monumental. This was observed even in the times of Jesus. So now 164 to 63 BC is known as the Hasmonean dynasty for that reason. It was founded by Judas Maccabeus and his brothers. And of course, as I mentioned, the temple was cleansed and rededicated in 164. They had regained political independence under Simon Maccabeus at around 142 BC. And the dynasty combined priestly and political power, and the Hasmoneans were both high priests and kings. So they kind of rebooted Judaism. So now we have an occupation by Rome in 63 BC and onward by Pompey the Great of Rome, and he did intervene in the Hasmonean Civil War. Jerusalem was taken by Rome and the temple was violated. Judea became a Roman client kingdom, which means they had some form of independence, but they were always subject to Rome. So some of that autonomy was given to Hyrcanus II, high priest but not a king, and Antipater, which is father of Herod, was appointed the procurator. So things are getting complicated. Rome is in charge, but are allowed through client kings to have a certain amount of autonomy. And between 37 BC and AD 6 is the Herodian dynasty. Herod the Great ruled between 37 and 4 BC, and he was appointed king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. Idumean by ancestry, he was very unpopular. He was politically cunning. In other words, he was sneaky, kind of tell you what you needed to hear so that he could get his way. Very lavish. He turned the Second Temple into like a Las Vegas Caesar's Palace type structure and environment. Something was very unnecessary. He was very paranoid and very brutal, as we'll see when we get into Matthew chapter 2. So now we're really honed in on the times of Jesus. AD 6 through the 1st century AD is in Roman Judea. It was governed by Rome. They had prefects and procurators in charge. Prefects being the military and kind of the law enforcement. They're usually put in areas where there's a lot of volatility. And the procurators were basically the IRS, basically, of Rome. They maintained the order and collected the taxes. And religious matters were left largely to the Sanhedrin, which were the Jewish rulers kind of appointed as their judges. Pontius Pilate would be an example of a prefect, and we'll read about him. He was in charge or given some authority between AD 26 and 36. And he was the one that could have let Jesus go, but did not. When we get to this point, you really need to grasp the situation when we get to that crucifixion. Like, there's no reason why Pontius Pilate did not let him go. I think God hardened his heart because all of the things that would have had to happen to fulfill the scripture to be our sacrifice would not have happened. So this is a dark situation, but it was anointed by God. So we need to really meditate on that when we get to that. It's a very powerful situation. Now that we have that kind of history and background, the next study, we're going to start getting into the birth of Christ, the announcement of the birth of Christ, and we're going to look into the dark heart of Herod. Here are my sources. I'm going to leave sources and attributes as much as I can, and that way we can all kind of hold ourselves accountable. So God bless you guys. The next one will be Matthew chapters 18 through 25, and we'll go over the birth of Jesus. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be an amazing study. God bless you.